Silas, I know this is a change, but the fence stays.
I figured as much. It's your call.
Good. It's for the best.
If you say so.
Silas Boggs had been home from Hendricks Medical Center for exactly 4 hours, still moving slow from hip surgery, still using a cane he swore he'd throw in the creek by next week, when he walked out onto his front porch with his coffee and saw a brand new 6-foot chain-link fence stretching across the entire front of his 160-acre cattle ranch, blocking his gate, his cattle guard, and the only road to his hay barn. And for a moment, that didn't feel like a moment at all, but rather like the whole world had shifted sideways without asking permission. The fence was something you'd expect to see at a prison, or maybe around a municipal pool, not at a working cattle ranch in Palo Pinto County, Texas. It was the kind of fence that didn't belong here, didn't make sense here, stood up against the land like an accusation. The chain link caught the late afternoon sun and threw it back at him, all glint and shine, brand new and aggressive. Behind it, you could see the cattle standing in the paddock, their heads turned toward the gate they'd used for decades. The barn his daddy had built in 1958 rose up behind them, weathered wood and old tin roof, solid as a prayer. The corrals where he'd worked cattle since he was knee-high to a grasshopper sat empty now, waiting for him. Silas didn't move for a long moment. His coffee was still hot enough to steam. His hip where the surgeon had gone in with his hardware, and his promises of better days was throbbing in a way that made him want to sit down on the porch steps and not move for about a year. But he didn't sit. He stood there, this tall, lean man in his faded straw hat and his pearl snap shirt. And he looked at that fence like he was reading something written in a language he'd never learned, but could understand perfectly well anyway. His wife Hazel came out onto the porch behind him, worried the way she'd been worried since the hospital called about his hip 2 years back. She was a small woman with silver hair pinned up neat as always, wire-rimmed glasses, and an apron she'd probably die wearing because she always had one on, even when she was in the garden or the barn or anywhere else. A woman shouldn't need an apron but did anyway. She'd been married to Silas for 49 years, and she knew his face the way you know your own reflection. This was a face she didn't recognize. "Silas," she said, and that was all. Just his name. He didn't answer her. He set his coffee cup down on the porch rail, careful-like, and walked toward the fence. His cane made a soft tap-tap on the porch boards, then the gravel of the drive. When he reached the fence, he put his hand on it. You could see his fingers, all calloused and scarred from 56 years of cattle work, against the bright silver of the chain link. The metal was cold even in the late afternoon heat. He didn't try to shake it or test it. He just felt it there, put his hand on it like he was checking if something was alive. The ranch itself hadn't changed. It was as it had always been, the way his granddaddy had found it when he had bought the land back in 1941, cleared the mesquite with his own hands and his own plow, built something that meant something. His daddy had taken those cleared acres and made them work, had run 200 head of Herefords at the best of it, had built the barn and the corrals, and had taught Silas everything worth knowing about cattle and land and what a man's word was supposed to mean. Silas had kept it going, scaling back to about 80 head as the years took their toll on his knees and his back and everything else that gets old if you work hard enough for long enough. But it was all still there. The land was still good. The corrals still stood. The barn roof might have had a sag to it now, and there was some equipment scattered around that had been waiting for repair since the early part of the decade, and the cattle were fewer than they'd been, but it was a working ranch, not a disaster. It was a place. It was a life. It was something that had been built by hands you could trace if you cared to, something that had been loved the way you love a person you've known since before you had language for it. This morning, before any of that, before the hospital, before the fence, Silas had done what he'd done every morning of his adult life. He'd gotten up at 4:30 in the dark, his knees creaking as they did now, and made his way to the kitchen where the old stove waited. He put the coffee pot on, the same stovetop percolator he'd been using for 30 years, and while it brewed, he stood at the window and watched the darkness over the land. His hip had been bad even then, but some mornings it didn't scream as much as others. This had been one of those mornings. The sky was still the color of wet slate, the stars still visible, the world still quiet in that way. It's only quiet before the sun comes up. When the coffee was done, he'd poured a cup into his old clay mug, the one with the chip on the handle, and he walked out to the barn. Just him and the sound of his boots on the gravel drive, steady and rhythmic, the way he'd done it thousands of times. You could hear the cattle moving in the paddock, settling from sleep, rustling in the hay. The barn door swung open the way barn doors do, creaking a little, and inside was the smell of hay and manure and morning dew, the smell of work and animals and life that moves on its own schedule, indifferent to what you plan or what the world does to you. He'd checked the stock tank, made sure the water level was good. He'd run his hand down the back of a cow that was getting old, checking her ribs, making sure she was doing all right. He'd looked at the young calves, the ones that had been born just the week before, still finding their legs, still learning how to be cattle. The light had been coming up over the horizon, soft and golden, turning the dew on the grass into something that caught the light like it was precious. And Silas had stood there in that barn, in that light, and he'd thought that this right here, was what mattered. Not what anybody thought about how it looked, not whether some woman in a yellow blazer approved. This. The land, the animals, the work that needed doing. This was the life. Now, the thing about Silas is he wasn't the kind of man who got angry in the loud way. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't punch walls or kick things or have what you might call a temperament. What Silas had was a quiet certainty about the way things ought to be. And when that quiet certainty got violated, something in him went very still, like a cattle dog before it moves, like the moment right before a storm shows itself. He turned away from the fence and came back to the porch. Hazel watched him the whole way. He climbed the steps slow, holding the rail. When he got to her, he stood still for a moment, and then he walked past her into the house. She followed him, the way she had for almost 50 years, into the kitchen where the light was starting to go amber and gold through the western window. "Silas," she said again, "what are we going to do?" He stood in the kitchen and he looked at her, really looked at her, and then he said, "I'm going to make a phone call." She watched him stand there with his hand still on the kitchen counter, and she turned back to the window above the sink. The subdivision across the road caught the last of the afternoon light, all those identical houses lined up in their rows. She could remember when that was the Meeker hayfield, just grass and wildflowers and the sound of the mower in July. She could remember the smell of it, sweet and clean. Now it was driveways and mailboxes and people who weren't from here, people who'd brought the city with them and called it progress. She felt tired looking at it, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with watching something you knew change into something you didn't recognize. She wondered if the world was changing faster than any of them could keep up with, or if it had always been this way and she was just old enough now to notice it. Her hands were shaking a little as she stood there, so she put them on the counter and held still, waiting for Silas to do something. Waiting to see how you fight something that doesn't fight back the same way you do. See, to understand where this fence came from, you've got to understand a little about what had happened 2 years before that Tuesday afternoon, when Silas came home from the hospital. Across the county road from Silas's property, what used to be the Meeker family's hayfield had gotten sold to some developer from out of state. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, because this story is a reminder that some fences shouldn't ever be built. Subscribe to the HOA Trap for more. The Meeker family had been neighbors of a sort, though not the close kind. They'd kept that field for hay, cut it regular, kept it neat. Then old Frank Meeker passed, and his son wanted to sell, and that was that. The developer's outfit came in and put up Lone Star Ridge Estates, which was a planned community of 115 houses, all built to the same square footage requirements and color specifications, with a clubhouse and a pool and concrete curbing that looked like it was supposed to protect something. The houses went up fast within about 18 months, and people moved in from Dallas and Fort Worth. People who wanted to be out in the country but not too far, who wanted the idea of the country without too much of the actual country to deal with. That's when Sharon Pruitt arrived in Palo Pinto County, in a move that would have been comical if it hadn't ended up being so much trouble. She was a woman in her late 50s, dyed blonde hair that hung to her shoulders and never seemed to be anything less than perfect. Bright yellow blazer that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. Pencil skirt, heels that didn't make sense anywhere near an actual ranch or even a road that might have gravel on it. She moved into Lone Star Ridge Estates, into one of those houses that all looked just a little too much like each other, and within about 6 months, she'd gotten herself elected HOA board president. Now, what Sharon didn't understand, and what a lot of people moving to the country don't understand, is that land out here has history that goes deeper than you can see. The history isn't written down in most cases. It lives in the people who've been on it. Silas's granddaddy had cleared that land in 1941 with a plow and a prayer and a stubborn refusal to move. His daddy had built something good on it. Silas had kept it going. That's not a small thing, and you can't just erase it because it looks a certain way from the window of your air-conditioned house. But Sharon saw it that way. She saw Silas's ranch the way you might see a car that hadn't been washed in a while parked in the driveway next to your new house. It bothered her. The cattle bothered her. The old corrals bothered her. The barn with its sagging roof bothered her. The equipment scattered around the property, waiting to be fixed, bothered her. She was convinced, absolutely certain, in the way that only a person can be who's never heard someone tell her she was wrong, that Silas's ranch was driving down property values. The first time Sharon showed up at Silas's place, she came in the late afternoon when Silas was coming in from working cattle. She was driving one of those big SUVs that cost more than a year's good hay crop, and she was holding a clipboard like it was a Bible. She had a typed letter in her other hand, printed on official-looking Lone Star Ridge Estates HOA letterhead, with her signature at the bottom in blue ink that looked expensive. "Mr. Boggs," she said, and she hadn't even gotten all the way out of her vehicle when she started talking. "I'm Sharon Pruitt, president of the Lone Star Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to come speak with you personally about some concerns the board has about the visual impact of your property on our community values." Silas was dusty from the day's work. He had a smudge of blood on his wrist from where a cow had caught him with a horn. Nothing serious, just the kind of thing that happens when you work with animals. He looked at Sharon in her yellow blazer and her heels, and he didn't say anything for a moment, which was usually when you knew Silas was about to say something worth listening to. "Ma'am," he said finally, "those cattle were here before your neighborhood. They'll be here after." He took the letter from her, looked at it for about 5 seconds, folded it in half, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he tipped his hat, the same movement he'd been making since he was a boy, and he turned around and walked back toward his barn. That should have been the end of it. That should have been Sharon, understanding that Silas didn't care what she thought, that his land was his land, and that some things in this world weren't going to change just because somebody typed them up on official stationery. But it wasn't the end of it. About 3 weeks later, another letter came, this time by certified mail. Hazel signed for it. She brought it to Silas in the barn where he was fixing something, one of those perpetual projects, and he read it standing up, his hat tilted back on his head. This letter was different. This one demanded that Silas remediate his property. That was the word they used, remediate, like he had some kind of disease. The letter said he needed to screen his livestock from view, paint the barn, remove what they called derelict equipment. It listed out dates and deadlines. It was typed in 12-point Times New Roman, which has a way of making anything you write seem important and official. Silas folded this letter up too and put it in his shirt pocket. Hazel asked him what it said, and he told her, and she did what she always did when things got a little scary or uncertain. She worried. "Maybe we should talk to someone," she said. "Hazel," Silas told her, "they can't tell a man what to do with his own land." He said it with a certainty that should have settled things, and it did for a while. But Sharon Pruitt wasn't the kind of woman who understood the word no. She was the kind of woman who'd been told yes her whole life, probably, or had learned to find ways to get what she wanted anyway. So, about 2 weeks after that second letter, she showed up again, only this time she brought help. She had 2 members of the HOA board with her, both of them looking uncomfortable, both of them clearly wishing they were anywhere else. They came in a truck this time, and they came with cameras. Sharon was taking pictures of the ranch from the county road, documenting what she called violations, and when Silas and Coy, his ranch hand, came out to move some cattle from the south pasture, Sharon called out to them. "We're documenting these violations," she said. "For the record." Coy looked at Silas like he was trying to figure out what he was supposed to do about that. Silas just kept working cattle. He didn't look up at Sharon. He didn't acknowledge her. He just did his job, moving the cattle with Coy and the dogs, the way he'd been doing it for more than 50 years, the way his daddy had taught him, the way nobody from a planned community across a county road was going to change. If this story has you shaking your head, share it and subscribe to the HOA Trap, because what this old rancher does next is why you don't mess with a cattleman on his own land. A few days after Sharon came out with her camera and her clipboard, Silas made a trip into town to the feed store. He needed to pick up some mineral supplement and some salt blocks, things you need when you keep cattle. The feed store sat on the edge of Palo Pinto, a red metal building that had been there since the 70s, run now by a fellow named Tom Carver, who knew every rancher in the county by name, and what they ran and how many head they had. Tom was behind the counter when Silas came in, and he looked up from his paperwork like he'd been expecting him. "Silas," he said, "you heard about Sharon Pruitt been in here?" "No," Silas said. "She was in here about a week ago, asking all kind of questions. Wanted to know about property lines, wanted to know who'd owned the Meeker place, wanted to know if anybody complained about your ranch. Real interested in you, Silas. Asked me if the cattle smell bothered the houses across the road." Silas just shook his head. He paid for his feed and his salt and he left. But he knew. He knew that Sharon was building a case, that she was talking to people, that she was trying to get the whole community on her side. He knew that this wasn't going to be as simple as folding up a letter and putting it in his pocket. He knew that Sharon was the kind of person who made phone calls and took pictures and talked to people at the feed store, and that eventually all of that talking was going to have to mean something. Now, the thing about getting old is that it sneaks up on you. Silas had known his hip was bad for about 2 years. He'd just been living with it, doing what he'd always done, managing the pain the way you manage a lot of things on a ranch, which is to say you manage it and you don't complain about it much. But Hazel had been after him for those 2 years, to get it fixed proper, to go see the surgeon at Hendricks Medical Center in Abilene and get the surgery done while he was still young enough for it to matter. "You're not getting any older," she'd say, "and that hip isn't getting any better." She was right, the way she usually was about important things. So finally in late spring, Silas agreed. He called the surgeon's office. He had the preliminary appointments. He and Hazel drove up to Abilene for the surgery. The surgery itself was fine. These days they do that stuff with small incisions and they've got good pain medication, and the surgeon at Hendricks knew what he was doing. Silas was in the hospital for 5 days. Hazel stayed with him in his room, the way she stayed with him in everything, not saying much, but being there. She brought him books, terrible hospital magazines, and her worried face, which he loved, even if it exhausted him sometimes. While Silas was lying in that hospital bed, healing from the surgery that was supposed to make him better, Coy Stamper was keeping the ranch running. Coy was a good young man, early 30s, good with cattle, reliable, the kind of person you want working your land when you can't be there yourself. He fed the cattle. He checked the stock tank. He did everything that needed doing. And that's when Sharon Pruitt made her move. See, what Sharon didn't know, or maybe she did know and didn't care, was that you can't just put a fence on somebody else's land without permission. It's not like redecorating your living room. It's not something you get to do because you think the view would look better. It's a crime, actually. It's trespassing, and it's theft of property rights, and it's a bunch of other things that have actual legal names and actual consequences. But Sharon didn't think of it that way. Sharon thought of it as remedying a problem. She thought of it as improving the community. She hired a fencing contractor, a man named Dave Hutton, who ran a fencing business out of Palo Pinto, and she told him that she needed a 6-foot chain-link fence installed along the property line between Lone Star Ridge Estates and Silas's ranch. She told him it was approved by the county. She didn't tell him that the county had never even heard about it. She didn't tell him that she didn't have any authority to do this thing. Dave probably should have asked questions, probably should have insisted on proper surveys and documentation. But Dave was just trying to make a living, and Sharon had money, and she was very persuasive in that yellow blazer of hers. So Dave contracted out a survey, and the surveyor, a fellow named Rick Napier, did a job that wasn't careful enough. He didn't survey properly. He put those stakes in the ground based on what Sharon showed him, and those stakes ended up being about 8 feet onto Silas's property instead of on the actual property line. Dave didn't catch that mistake. Or maybe he did and didn't think it mattered. He brought his crew out while Silas was still in the hospital, still in Abilene, still lying in that bed with his hip all healing up, with Hazel sitting in the chair next to him, reading a paperback mystery novel. Coy was there when they started setting posts. He watched them working, moving through the morning, measuring and marking, digging holes where the posts were supposed to go. He was a young man, raised in the county, knew these ranches and these people. He knew that what was happening wasn't right, but he also knew that people with money and clipboards and official-looking paperwork could make things very hard for folks like him. He stood there with his hat in his hands, watching the posts come up, one after another, the frame of the fence starting to take shape. Finally, he went up to Dave and asked him what he was doing, and Dave told him that Sharon Pruitt had approved it. that it was for the community, that it had been approved by the county. Coy didn't believe him, not exactly, but he didn't know what to do about it either. He was just ranch help, making his living, working for a man he respected. Sharon Pruitt was a board president with a clipboard and a yellow blazer, and a car that cost more than everything Coy owned in the world. He called Silas in the hospital. "Mr. Boggs," he said, "there's a woman here from the subdivision putting up a fence." Silas, doped up on pain medication, told him not to worry about it. They'd sort it out when he got home. He didn't know that the fence was going to be 8 feet onto his property. He didn't know that it was going to block his gate. He didn't know that it was going to separate his cattle from the stock tank on the north side of his property, or that it was going to block access to the hay barn where he stored his feed and his equipment. After he hung up with Silas, Coy walked back out to where they were working. He stood at the fence line, watching the posts come up, watching the chain link being unrolled and measured. That afternoon, after the crew had packed up their trucks and driven away, Coy walked the fence line alone. His frustration was a physical thing, a weight in his chest. He put his hand on the chain link where they'd connected it to the post, feeling the way it was attached, the way it was real. He thought about Silas at home with his wife, recovering from surgery, not knowing what his ranch would look like when he got back. Coy knew this fence was wrong. He'd known it from the moment Dave told him Sharon had approved it. But there was nothing he could do. He was just a ranch hand. The fence was going up. The world had decided it needed to happen. Dave and his crew worked for 2 days. The fence came up fast, all bright chain link and new posts, brand new and completely wrong. The fence cut right across the front of Silas's property, across where his gate was, across the cattle guard he'd built to keep the cattle in when he moved them through, right along the county road. It was a professional fence. It was a good fence. It just wasn't supposed to be there. Emmett Colley, who ranched on the property next to Silas's, watched the whole thing from his own land. Emmett was in his early 70s himself, a good man, a man who'd known Silas for about 40 years. He thought about going over and saying something to Sharon, but he was intimidated by her, the way a lot of people were, the way she carried herself like she'd already won whatever conversation you were about to have with her. He watched them put the fence up, and he felt guilty about not doing anything, but he didn't do anything anyway. When Silas got home from the hospital on the 4th week of May, a Tuesday afternoon, Hazel drove because he wasn't supposed to be driving yet, still on pain medication, still moving slow. They pulled out of the road that went past Lone Star Ridge Estates, the new neighborhood with its identical houses and its irrigation systems, and headed toward the county road that went toward Silas's place. And that's when he saw it. The fence rose up in front of them like some kind of accusation. It was impossible to miss. It was right there, new and silver and completely wrong. Hazel pulled the truck to a stop. Neither of them said anything at first. Silas just looked at it, at the bright chain link, at the place where his gate used to be open, at the cattle standing on the other side of the fence, confused, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. "Oh, Silas," Hazel said. Silas didn't answer her. He opened the truck door, moving slow because his hip was still bad, still healing, still complaining about every movement. He pulled himself out, using the door frame and his cane. He walked toward the fence, moving slow but deliberate, not hurrying, not hesitating either. When he got there, he put his hand on the chain link. The sun was starting to get lower in the sky, and the light was golden and soft, and the fence was hot from the day. He felt the heat of it under his hand. He looked at where his gate should be. He looked at his land beyond the fence, at the corrals his granddaddy had built, at the barn his daddy had raised up, at the stock tank where cattle had drunk water since he was a boy. He stood there for a long time. Hazel waited in the truck. Her hands were probably shaking. She was the one who worried, who carried the fear of the family, who understood that sometimes bad things happened, and you had to figure out how to live with them. She watched Silas through the windshield, this tall man in his faded hat, his hand on a fence that shouldn't be there. Finally, Silas turned around and came back to the truck. He climbed in slow. Hazel asked him what they were going to do, and he told her he was going to make a phone call. They drove around the long way using the back road that ran past Emmett's place and came up toward the old access point, a rougher road that Silas had kept open for emergencies. They got to the house as the sun was getting ready to set. Hazel went inside to start supper. Silas didn't follow her. He went out onto the porch. Silas sat down in his favorite chair, the one that faced out toward the corrals and the barn. The light was going, the sky going from gold to orange to something darker. He could see the fence from here, silver in the last light, stretching across the front of his land like a scar. His hip was throbbing again, the surgery still fresh, still healing, still reminding him that he wasn't as young as he used to be. He was 74 years old. The ranch took everything he had. It always had. The work never stopped. The cattle had to be fed. The fence had to be mended. The barn roof was going to need work pretty soon. The corrals needed attention. It was endless, really, the work. And for a moment, sitting there in the failing light, he was tired. Not just from the surgery, though that was part of it. Tired of fighting. Tired of holding on to something that every year took a little more out of him. He wondered if Tommy even wanted it. His grandson was a smart kid, doing well in school, probably headed for something better than this. Something that didn't require his knees to give out, didn't require 56 years of the same thing over and over. He thought about selling, thought about what it would be like to just let go, to let somebody else worry about the fence and the cattle and the barn. Thought about how much easier that would be, how much simpler. Then he looked at the barn, dark now against the darker sky, and he heard his daddy's voice, something his daddy used to say on nights like this, when the work was done and you were tired and you wondered if any of it mattered. "Land doesn't leave you," his daddy had said. "You leave it." Simple words, true words. And Silas understood that he'd been the one this whole time who could choose. The land wouldn't make that choice for him. The ranch wouldn't walk away. Only he could do that, and he wasn't going to. He sat there a little longer, and then he got up and went back inside. Hazel had supper ready, but he barely touched it. He went to bed early, and he slept hard, the way you do when your body has been through something, and your mind hasn't caught up yet. The next morning, 6 o'clock, Silas was in the kitchen. The coffee was on. The light was just coming through the eastern window. He picked up the old rotary phone that hung on the wall, the one that had been there since the 70s, and he dialed a number he knew by heart because he'd been calling it for 40 years or more. Luther Epperson answered on the second ring. Luther was a retired Palo Pinto County judge, 78 years old, a man who'd spent his whole life in this county, who'd served as judge for 26 years before he retired. He and Silas had been fishing buddies at Possum Kingdom Lake for more than 40 years. They had a standing date most Thursdays to meet at the courthouse diner for lunch. And they knew each other the way people know each other after that much shared time, which is to say they knew each other's silences. They knew what things mattered. They knew when something had gone seriously wrong. "Luther," Silas said. "It's Silas. I need your help with something." "What's going on?" Luther asked. Silas told him the whole story in about 30 seconds. He told him about Sharon Pruitt and the HOA and the fence that went up while he was in the hospital. He told him that the fence was on his property, that it blocked his gate and his access to the hay barn and his north pasture. He told him that Sharon had told the fence contractor it was approved by the county, when it wasn't. Luther was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Silas, you sit tight. I'll handle this." Luther Epperson knew the law. More than that, he knew Palo Pinto County. He knew the people in it. He was the one who drafted the county's agricultural protection ordinance back in 1994, when he saw that rural land was starting to come under pressure from development, when people moving in from the cities were starting to forget that agriculture had been here first. He still had lunch at the courthouse diner every Thursday. He still knew everyone. He still had people's phone numbers in his head because he'd been calling them for 30 years. Luther made 2 phone calls. The first one was to Frank Jett, the county attorney. The second one was to Sheriff Doyle Tackett. Luther explained to Frank what had happened. He explained that a fence had been installed on private agricultural property without the owner's permission. He explained that it blocked access to the working ranch, which violated the agricultural protection ordinance that Luther himself had written. He explained that the fence contractor had been lied to about county approval. He explained that an HOA, whether they liked it or not, had 0 jurisdiction over non-member agricultural property, and that Sharon Pruitt had no authority to do what she'd done. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button. It takes 1 second, it's free, and it helps the HOA Trap reach more folks who've dealt with this kind of thing. Now, back to the story. Frank understood. Frank had been the county attorney for 12 years. He'd seen people try to push agriculture around before, and he knew that the law was clear on this one. The fence was trespassing. The fence was a violation. The fence had to come down. Luther explained the same things to Sheriff Tackett. Doyle Tackett was in his mid-50s, a man who'd grown up on a ranch himself, who understood what a working cattle ranch meant, who understood what property rights were because he'd learned them at the same kind of supper table that Silas had. Doyle had been sheriff for 8 years, and he didn't take kindly to people breaking the law because they didn't like how something looked. The next day, Sheriff Tackett showed up at Silas's ranch with a county surveyor named Rick Napier. Not the same Rick Napier who'd done the sloppy survey for Sharon, but a different one. A fellow named Richard Napier who did things properly. They surveyed the fence, they took measurements, they documented everything. And sure enough, the fence was 8 feet onto Silas's property. There was no question about it. There was no ambiguity. The fence was on the wrong side of the property line, which meant it was trespassing, which meant it was a crime. Sheriff Tackett came up to Silas's porch, where Silas was sitting with a fresh cup of coffee. He had a removal order with him, printed on official county paperwork, with all the legal language and official seals. "Mr. Boggs," he said, "that fence comes down in 72 hours. The HOA can remove it at their expense, or the county removes it and triples the bill and sends it to them." "Much obliged, Sheriff," Silas said. Sheriff Tackett got back in his truck and drove straight to Sharon's house in Lone Star Ridge. Sharon answered the door in her bright yellow blazer, her hair done up perfect, her face doing that thing it did when she was about to explain something she thought was important. Sheriff Tackett handed her the removal order. He didn't mince words. He told her that she'd installed a fence on private property without the owner's permission. He told her that the fence was 8 feet onto Silas Boggs's property. He told her that she had 72 hours to remove it at her expense, or the county would do it and triple the bill. He told her that criminal trespass charges were being considered. He told her that lying to a contractor about county authorization was itself a crime. Sharon went white. The yellow blazer seemed too bright all of a sudden, like maybe she'd made a mistake in choosing it. She tried to argue. She said that Silas's ranch was a hazard, that it was driving down property values, that she was just trying to improve the community. She tried saying that the board had approved it, though it hadn't. She tried saying that Silas had agreed to it, though he hadn't. Each time Doyle just calmly laid out the facts. Each excuse collapsed under the weight of what was true. She realized she was out of moves. "Ma'am," Doyle said, "that ranch has been there since 1941. Your subdivision's been there 2 years. You put a fence on a man's property while he was in the hospital. That's not a community safety measure. That's trespassing." And that was that. The HOA had an emergency board meeting that evening. It was a disaster from Sharon's perspective. The board members were furious. Sharon had acted without board approval. She'd spent $14,000 of HOA funds on the fence without authorization. She'd exposed the entire association to criminal liability and civil lawsuits. The homeowners were scared because suddenly they understood that what had seemed like a reasonable board president with a yellow blazer was actually someone who could get all of them sued. Sharon tried to defend herself. She tried to explain that she was trying to protect property values. She tried to say that Silas's ranch was a blight. She tried to make it sound like she'd been thinking of everyone's best interests. None of it worked. One of the board members moved that Sharon resign on the spot. The motion passed unanimously. Sharon had been president for less than 2 years, and now she wasn't anymore. She tried to save face, tried to make it seem like she was choosing to step down, but everyone knew what had really happened. She'd stepped over a line, and the line had stepped back. The new board voted immediately to have the fence removed. They voted to reimburse Silas $12,000 for property damage and access disruption. They voted to cooperate fully with the sheriff's investigation into criminal trespass. By the end of the meeting, they were calling contractors to take the fence down as fast as possible. If the HOA Trap has become part of your week, think about joining the channel membership. Just a couple bucks a month keeps these stories coming. Links below. Now, back to the story. Emmett Colley came over to Silas's porch the day after the board meeting. Emmett was carrying guilt like you carry a heavy bucket, and you could see it in the way he held himself. "Silas," he said, "I watched them put that fence up. I knew it was wrong. I should have said something." Silas was sitting in his favorite chair, the one he'd been sitting in for about 15 years, the one that faced out toward the corrals and the barn. His hip was still bothering him, still healing, but he was moving better every day. "Emmett," he said, "you're here now. That's what matters." Emmett gave his statement to the sheriff. He said what he'd seen. When he'd seen it, that Sharon had told the contractor it was all approved, that the whole thing had happened while Silas was in the hospital, that he'd wanted to do something about it but hadn't known what. His testimony became part of the legal record. Criminal charges were filed against the contractor, Dave Hutton. Dave, when he got his turn to talk to the authorities, gave up everything. He said that Sharon had told him the fence was approved by the county. He had documentation, emails back and forth, in which Sharon had assured him that everything was legal and proper and covered. Dave said he never would have taken the job if he'd known it was trespassing. Dave said he was sorry. The charges against Dave ended up being dropped because he'd essentially been defrauded by Sharon into doing the work. The charges against Sharon for fraud and conspiracy to commit trespass and lying to the contractor were more complicated. The county attorney was going to pursue them, but it was going to take time. It didn't matter much to Silas. What mattered was that the fence was coming down. On a Tuesday morning, about 2 weeks after the board meeting, a fencing crew pulled up to Silas's property. Not the same crew that had put the fence up, but a professional removal crew that the HOA had hired. They had equipment and they had authorization and they had the document that said they had to take the fence down. Silas watched from his porch. Hazel brought him coffee. His hip was still healing, still sore, but he was moving better, getting stronger every day. The crew unbolted the fence sections. They pulled up the posts. They took the whole thing down in about 6 hours. When they were done, Coy opened the gate again. The cattle walked through like nothing had happened, heading toward the stock tank on the north side, toward the hay barn, toward the part of the ranch that had been cut off from them for weeks now. The gate swung open on its hinges the way it had for decades, the way it was supposed to. Silas sat in his chair and watched them go. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The land was his again. The ranch was open again. Everything was the way it was supposed to be. After about an hour, when the crew was packing up their equipment, Silas stood up. His hip didn't hurt as much as it had. Maybe that was the surgery doing its job. Maybe it was something else. He walked out to where the fence used to be, to the place where Coy was checking on the cattle, making sure they'd made it through okay, making sure nothing was hurt. "Looks good," Coy said. "Looks right," Silas said. And that was the end of that chapter. But this is a story, and stories don't really end. They just shift into different scenes, different moments. The summer came on hot and dry, the way summer does in north central Texas. Silas got stronger every week. His physical therapy was going well. The hip surgery had worked, like the surgeon said it would. He could move more naturally, he could work more. His cane disappeared into a corner of the barn, and he forgot about throwing it in the creek because he never really needed to pick it up again. Tommy, his grandson, came to visit for the summer, like he always did. Tommy was 9 years old, a bright kid with his grandfather's lean build, and his grandfather's way of looking at the world like there was something in it worth understanding. The two of them walked the fence line together, Silas and Tommy, walking the real fence, the barbed wire fence that his granddaddy had strung, that his daddy had maintained, that Silas had kept up all these years. Silas was checking for loose staples, for wire that had gotten weak, for places where the fence needed attention. That was a ranch skill, that kind of checking, that kind of maintenance. It was something you did regular, something you did because it mattered, because a fence is the difference between a working ranch and a place where cattle can go wherever they want, and nothing makes sense. "Grandpa," Tommy said, "was that fence the bad one?" "What fence?" Silas asked, though he knew exactly which fence Tommy meant. "The one from before, the shiny one." "Yes, sir, that was the bad one." "Where did it go?" "It came down," Silas said. "Sometimes things don't work out the way people plan." They walked further, checking the fence, and Silas showed Tommy how to work the staples, how to make sure they were tight, how to feel the difference between fence that was going to hold and fence that was getting ready to fail. That was real knowledge, the kind that got passed down through hands and time, the kind that couldn't be written down in a manual or learned on the internet. It was understanding built from 56 years of work, from watching his daddy, from listening to his granddaddy, from doing this thing day after day after day. That evening, when they got back to the house, they walked past the for sale sign that had been in Sharon's yard for about 2 months. She'd decided to move back to Dallas. Silas didn't feel satisfied about that. He didn't feel like she'd learned a lesson. He just figured that some people you can't reach, and the best you can do is make sure they don't take your land with them when they go. A few weeks later, Silas got a letter from the new HOA president, a fellow named Marcus Webb, who'd lived in Lone Star Ridge for about 8 months and been drafted into the job because nobody else wanted it. The letter was an apology. Marcus said he was sorry for what happened, sorry that the HOA had overstepped, sorry that Silas had to deal with that while he was recovering from surgery. He said the board was implementing better oversight, better procedures, better understanding of property rights and what they could and couldn't do. Silas read the letter. He folded it up. He put it in his shirt pocket, the same place he'd put Sharon's first letter, the same gesture, the same movement. Some things change and some things don't. Some people learn and some people go back to Dallas. Some land stays in the hands of the people who've made it what it is. Silas Boggs is still running his ranch. He's got about 80 head of cattle, same as always. His hip is good now. The surgery worked the way the surgeon said it would. He moves better than he has in years. Coy's still working for him. Hazel's still in her apron. Tommy still visits in the summer. The barn is still there. The one his daddy built in 1958. The corrals are still there. The ones his granddaddy built. And the land is still there. 8 generations deep in the Boggs family now, and it's not going anywhere. The fence line is clear. The cattle can walk to the stock tank. The gate stays open. The ranch works the way a ranch is supposed to work, the way it's worked since 1941, the way it'll probably work as long as there's someone with Boggs blood willing to do the work. And if someone asks you about it, about what happened that spring when a woman in a yellow blazer tried to fence off a piece of land that wasn't hers, about what you do in that situation, about whether it's worth fighting for the place you love, you can tell them what Silas knows. Sometimes you just have to make a phone call. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you that some land has deeper roots than any clipboard can reach, please share it. Subscribe to the HOA Trap for more stories about folks who knew their land better than anyone who tried to take it. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you came home from the hospital and found a fence across your ranch?